Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our podcast. I'm your host, Trisha, and today we are diving into a hot topic: how Western sanctions on Russian oil are transforming the tanker market and global shipping. And joining us today to break it all down is Sandesh, an expert in shipping and global trade. Welcome, Sandesh.
Well, thanks for having me, Trisha. I am excited to dive into this complex topic with you.
All right, so let's start with the shadow fleet. So, this has been a growing trend in global shipping since Western sanctions kicked in. And so, can you tell us, Sandesh, what exactly is the shadow fleet and how has it grown in response to the sanctions? Can you give us some key statistics to show just how big it's getting?
Trisha, that's a great question. The shadow fleet is essentially a group of vessels. Those are designed to operate under the radar. You know, they do is they evade the international sanctions by using deceptive tactics. These ships often turn up their tracking devices and sometimes they sail under false flag. And they have a kind of a complicated ownership structure so that they can hide their activities. They primarily transport sanctioned oil from countries like Russia, Iran, Venezuela, even Libya, Cuba. So this kind of trade they are engaged into, and those are the buyers. They are exist in the market. They willing to skirt global trade restrictions. Now you have said about the rise of shadow fleet. Now to understand its growth, let's look at some key numbers. As of late 2023, Ukraine has identified 238 shadow tankers. Those are actively transporting sanctioned oil. Now, with the combined capacity exceeding 100 million deadweight tons, that's about 17% of world oil tanker fleet. And it is an alarming number for an industry where transparency is critical. This fleet has grown rapidly in response to Western sanctions imposed on Russia after it evades Ukraine. To give an example for context, back in early 2022, the Shadow fleet was significantly smaller, but it has since been expanding by roughly 10 vessels per month. So, if I have to give a staggering statistics, Shadow tankers have facilitated the transport over 75% of Russia's increased oil export to China and India. And these are the two largest buyer of discounted crude because Russia started giving discounted on their Urals grade. So in 2023 alone, Russia earned an estimated $188 billion, and that those are coming only from oil export. And then it followed by Iran. They were also getting $53 billion, and much of it through these covert operations. That means this sanctioned tankers transporting crude oil for both of these countries. Having said that, the real story here is the volume of oil these ships are transporting. So now, if I have to give an example, Russian oil, which has been under price caps and sanctions, is still flowing out of Russia and just through these shadow fleets. What this tells you is that sanctions are not working, and we have seen a new packages every now and then. So we can currently say that these sanctions are not working. Even the price cap is not working because Russian oil tankers or the tankers those are engaged in shadow fleet, they have found a loophole to avoid those kind of tactics. Just last year, Russia's oil export to China and India surged over by 75%, and much of that is being moved by this hidden fleet. Talking about India, the scenario is very different from what we have seen prior to Russian invasion of Ukraine. Indian companies have a contract with Russian companies for so-called crude, and eventually they supposed to buy that particular crude, but the contracted price for the so-called crude is so high that they preferred Urals crude, which is available cheaper in the spot market. And what this tells us that the key reason of this trade is money. So these shadow vessels, those are cheaper to operate because they are older and not subject to same regulations. So they are able to move oil to just discounted about 40 $50 per barrel compared to 70 $80 per barrel, and you would pay for non-sanctioned oil because you are saving around 30 $35 per barrel. At least you were saving during just after the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So having said that, it's not just about the numbers. The risk this vessel pose are immense because many of these ships are outdated. They were poorly maintained. They lack proper insurance. did not have a survey for long times, and they were operating under the flag of convenience. That means whatever flag is convenience for them to hide their operations, they're supposed to go with those flag of operations. And with the unclear ownership, they threaten environmental and maritime safety. So ownership is also a key concern for this shadow fleet, because sometimes single vessel owned by multiple parties, and then it will be difficult to track them. We have seen a trend where these companies, these single owner companies or single tanker owner companies, they hired executives from top oil firms which are now retired, and they currently running those business by operating from countries like Panama and others, specifically in the Latin America and UAE, Turkey, such kind of countries. Since 2022, shadow tankers have been involved in over 50 reported incidents, and those incidents are mostly collisions, or those are transit to sensitive areas like Arctic, where they are not equipped to handle icy conditions. And Trisha, the shadow fleet operates largely outside the reach of international law, and they operate using tactics like ship to ship transfers in the international waters, and they conceal the origin of their cargo. If I have to give an example, sanctioned Russian oil is often mixed with other crude, and making it harder to trace, because then the resultant grade will be totally different. And by doing that, you have already changed the paper, then it will be very difficult to understand which crude is there inside that mix. And these deceptive practices have turned this hidden fleet into a key enabler for sanctioned nations to bypass restrictions. Interestingly, while 134 of these ships are blacklisted by Western authorities, enforcements remain inconsistent. Some vessels are still accessing key maritime routes, passing through heavily trafficked straits without adequate pilotage or safety checks, and that raise concerns about the potential environment disaster. The government and international organizations are stepping up efforts to counter these activities, because they have to, as they have give their assistance, or they have give their significance towards the COP, and reduce the activities those are related to environmental concerns. And in those particular organizations or countries, the EU, for instance, recently passed its 15th sanction package, increasing the number of blacklisted tankers and targeting maritime service firms that facilitate such operations. So, like I said earlier, that sanctions are not working because we are seeing an additional packages every now and then. So now we are in the 15th package, and it still suggests that the sanctions are not working. But what it impacting is that they blacklisting some tankers so that it can reduce the oil operating activities by these shadow tankers. So measures like banning ship to ship transfer in territorial waters, imposing secondary sanctions on cooperating companies, and blocking passage for sanctioned vessel in the international states are being considered by some of the organizations and even EU. Trisha, despite these efforts, enforcement challenges persist, especially with the major buyers like China and India. Those are continue to receive oil transported by this vessel, because in current view, or if you see the current trend, they have shifted their dependence from the traditional buyers to the cheaper available buyers. Those are from China and from other countries, specifically China, who was also getting oil from Iran and Venezuela. And this shadow fleet, though operating in the secrecy, it has become a significant player in the global oil trade. And in result, it reshapes the market, and thus creating ripple effect that extend far beyond shipping.
Well, that's definitely a lot of ships in the shadows. Anyway, Sandesh would rightly said. So, moving on, one big area of concern when it comes to sanctioned tankers is insurance. So, tell us, Sandesh, how have sanctions affected tanker insurance? And what do you think are the risks involved in operating these shadow fleet vessels?
Trisha, you have asked me a right question. The insurance has become a critical issue for tankers operating in this shadow fleet, and the recent trend is evidence for that. Now, if we think about the sanctions, we have to also look for vessels prior to sanctions. So, prior to the sanctions, most Russian tankers were insured by large, reputable Western firms, and those Western firms provided comprehensive coverage against risks like oil spills, collisions, and there are some other liabilities also. So, however, the imposition of sanctions forced these insurers to withdraw. It leaves the Russian tankers scrambling for alternatives. So, today a significant number of these shadow fleet vessels, approximately around 30%, those are operate without any insurance coverage at all. And that exposes the global shipping industry to enormous risk. Let's think about this. If a major incident like an oil spill or collision were to occur, the financial and environmental consequences could be a very catastrophic. For example, in 2023, a shadow tanker caused a minor oil spill in the Mediterranean, and that oil spill incurred damages exceeding 200 million. Now, this was a small scale disaster. Let's imagine a large scale disaster. If there was a large scale disaster, the cost could reach a billions with little to no recourse for a compensation. The similar condition we have seen when we saw the Macondo oil blast in the US Gulf Coast, where initially lot of analysts and oil companies thought that these losses could be minimal and it will be merely couple of 100 millions. But later we understood that BP spent around $3 to $4 billion on that. But since it was not a shipping incident, it was a more like an extractor incident. But if shipping incident happened and there could be a large oil spill, we could see a similar kind of compensation needs to be released. Because we are talking about the larger vessels here. We talking about VLCC. Those can transport around 2 million barrels, and then we have some chemical tankers who has transporting some very hazardous chemical. So the rescue and compensation will be very, very difficult in such case. Now, in response to the sanctions, many shadow fleet operators have turned to smaller and even less reliable insurance providers, and they were often based in the jurisdictions like Kyrgyzstan, Seychelles, or even Panama. So these are some of the small kind of a countries or island where the environment or business environment is kind of favorable for such kind of insurance providers. So while this insurance offers cheaper premiums, their policies often provide minimal coverage, and then this makes them an inadequate for addressing large scale disaster. Having said that, you can have an insurance for your vessel, but that insurance coverage is very minimal. So in the event of large scale disaster, even this particular insurer will not able to help the vessel owners. And having said that, additionally, the lack of stringent oversight from this insurance, they raise safety concerns. Now, those are especially for the vessels navigating congested or environmentally sensitive areas. And Trisha, this lack of proper insurance coverage has led to increased scrutiny from governments and international regulators. If I have to give an example, for instance, a coalition of 12 European countries, they recently announced plans to check the insurance documentation of suspected shadow fleet vessels passing through the critical waterways like the English Channel, the Danish Strait, and the Gulf of Ireland. So this is a part of a broader effort to disrupt shadow fleet operations without physically halting the vessel, which could provoke retaliation or disrupt global trade flows. So now, having said that, you have to also understand this English Channel or Danish Strait or even the Gulf of Finland. In a maritime perspective, those are the smaller areas where larger oil can be transported or even the existing trade is taking place. Here we are talking about the big channels like Suez Canal, then we talk about Red Sea, then we talk about Bab Mandate Strait. So these are coming under the international waters, and thus we don't have any significant authority present in the global space. Those can able to monitor or those can check the insurance documentation. And the other perspective for the same is that the vessel owners or cargo owners, they should also support this initiative, because vessels traveling in the international waters, and if a non-significant organization started checking every such vessels, then it will be kind of a problem for every entity that is present in that particular transaction. Even we can see that more congestion levels, we can see a kind of a threat to the trade also. And I know I'm talking these points on a very curious level, but the impact of this could be very, very high if vessel checks started in the areas like Bab el-Mandeb Strait or even Suez Canal. So having said that, we have UK that has taken an even stronger tons. So they blacklisted over 100 vessels, and that includes an additional 20 tanker recently flagged for their role in the transporting Russian oil. So earlier we used to see that US OFAC, they're supposed to blacklist vessels and vessel owners and some of the marine suppliers. Those are in relation to the transportation of Russian oil. But now UK also started the same thing. And together these measures, those are designed to target operators circumventing sanctions and those cutting off access to the legitimate maritime services. But however, enforcement remains challenging as most shadow fleet vessels operate under opaque ownership structures, and they have a flag of convenience which we have discussed in earlier question. But the risk associated with this uninsured or underinsured vessels, I will say, they extend beyond financial and legal realms because they also pose serious environmental threats. So, if any large scale vessel are getting involved in a accident, there could be financial repercussions and we can evaluate them. But there are serious environmental threats which sometimes may remain undervalued, or the effect of such environmental threats we'll see time later than a year or so. So valuation of environmental threats is still challenging. We can support the financial repercussions, but we cannot support the environmental repercussions because evaluation of environmental threats, it can be a challenging or cannot be valued in circumstances like this. So when we talk about these environmental threats, we have to see many of these shadow fleet or the vessels, those under the shadow fleet, these ships are older and those are poorly maintained, and that makes them more prone to the accident. Now since 2022, shadow tankers have already been involved in over 50 reported incidents, which we already talked. But these 50 reported incidents, those are not just incident, those are excluding the near misses in crowded shipping lanes, and some of them are unsafe transits through the icy waters. So if we calculate all these incidents together, these incidents highlight the urgent need for stricter oversight and enforcement. Now compounding the issue is the willingness of major oil importers like India and China to continue buying oil from these shadow fleets, bypassing Western sanctions. So this demand incentivizes shadow fleet operators to keep sailing despite the risk involved. Now, as of November 2023, over 80% of Russia's seaborne crude export were transported by vessels, those not flagged or insured by G7 aligned entities. And this demonstrates the limited reach of Western sanctions. So this is a lingering question, but we cannot avoid that particular imports because these are very, very price sensitive countries and they have to buy oil. They will go into the market and buy the cheapest oil in the market. And since Russia is supplying us cheapest barrel through discounts, we kind of heavily relied on Russia. And for China, they were also heavily relied on Russian oil as well as Iranian oil. As of today, 90% of Iranian oil, that means around 98% of oil, those are going from the Kurg island of Iran. It is going to China. And these are vessels, those are going to China, are the vessel under the ownership of Iranian oil companies. So this is the highlight from China and India. So to summarize, the shadow fleets, they lack the reliable insurance significantly, and it increases the risk of accidents, and it has a potentially devastating consequence. The international community faces a pressing challenge to address these gaps, and this not only to enforce sanctions effectively but also to prevent environmental disasters and ensure maritime safety. And this maritime safety insurance is a massive issue for tankers right now. Before the sanctions, most of the Russian-owned vessels were insured by large Western firms. Now, these companies covered risks like oil spills, accidents, and other liabilities. But with the sanctions, these insurers pulled out, and that leaves Russian tankers in a very, very tough spot.
Amazing, Sandesh. That is a detailed explanation and overview that I think our listeners would definitely appreciate. Now, taking some cues from your earlier explanation, you have talked about several straits like the Danish Strait and the Bab el Mandeb Strait, which are major choke points in global shipping trade. So, I would also like to discuss another such important choke point, which is the Malacca Strait, which is one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. So, with more and more vessels in the shadow fleet, How is congestion in these crucial shipping lanes affecting global trade and oil prices?
The tanker congestion is definitely becoming a huge issue for tanker industry. And if I have to talk about the Strait of Malacca, for example, it is a critical choke point for a global trade. Over the 50,000 vessels, those pass through this particular strait each year. And right now, the growth of shadow fleet, it is getting more crowded. These vessels are often sailing slower, and in some cases, they are waiting to transfer oil from one ship to another in the mid sea, and we call it that as STS transfer, and that further clogs up the waterways. So the waiting time in the major ports like Singapore, Rotterdam, and even in the Middle East, they have increased significantly in the recent months. And for example, a few months ago, ships were waiting an average of 10 to 12 days to dock in some Asian ports, particularly those in the South China Sea. Now, this is causing a delays in the delivery of goods and oil shipments, because this 10 to 12 days of delays is kind of a lot in terms of vessel employment. So for one voyage, there will be a 12 days of delays. So you can imagine what could be the number of days of delays for the rest of the year and for the rest of voyages. So having said that, it is a problem in the industry for the shadow fleet tankers. But what's more is that this congestion is driving up the cost of shipping, because the oil tankers in particularly have seen their freight rate rise by 15 to 20% due to these delays. And that's a significant when you are talking about transporting millions of barrels of oil. So, if I have to say, there is also another aspect to it, and that aspect is through the geopolitics. Because now a vessel which is supposed to go from Suez Canal, due to Red Sea crisis, this has to go all the way to the Cape of Good Hope. Now that increased the ton miles, that increased the actual voyage days, and with that, it also increases the waiting time. So for a vessel, let's say for example, it is reaching its destination in X amount of time. Now it needs another Y amount of time because of rerouting of vessel, plus another Z kind of a factor of time because there is a delay, and that eventually increases the cost of the freight, because now vessel is getting engaged more. So there will be a shortage of vessels, there will be further increase in the congestion days. So it's kind of eventually impacting the buyer, and it is the extra cost of the freight, it eventually passed on to the end customer. So talking specifically about the delays, these delays also contribute to the oil price volatility, because typically oil prices are affected by supply and demand. But with tankers now they stuck in these congested shipping lanes, the uncertainty around delivery times and cost is pushing prices up. In fact, we have seen oil prices, they fluctuate by as much as 10% in a single month, and just based on the disruption caused by the congestion only. So to put this in a perspective, let's say that a delay of just few days in a key oil exporting region, it can lead to the shortages in certain countries and spike in prices. For example, if a country is buying any Middle Eastern oil or specific Middle Eastern grade, with the vessel is getting delayed due to congestion, with the rerouting, the cost of this entire grade for the buyer is increased, and then eventually he have to go for another supply chain momentum, another crude oil grade, and then there will be a disturbance of demand and supply of crude oil grades. We can see that in a larger perspective, but it is there. So this not just affect the oil market, but it also has a broader economic impact, and this includes the higher fuel cost for the customers. So the congestion is just not about the long wait times. It's actively changing the dynamics of global trade, specifically in terms of oil and petroleum products. And thus, it's making it harder to predict oil prices and delivery schedules, because it can deteriorate some data points on which the prediction is based on, because we have such a mathematical model present with us where it can impact the oil prices, and it can just neglect, or it can gives us a false forecasting of oil prices.
That was very rightly said, Sandesh. Now, we've talked a lot about impacts on tankers and shipping routes, but let's zoom out a bit. So, tell us, Sandesh, how are these sanctions reshaping the global oil trade? And do you think these changes are permanent or just a temporary disruption?
Well, thanks, Trisha, for asking me the question. The sanctions are transforming the global oil trade in a ways that may signal a long-term shift. If I have to see the market before February 2022, Russia relied heavily on Europe and United States as a major buyer of its oil and gas. So I'm talking this in terms of both oil and gas because Europe is getting maximum gas and United States they were getting some of the oil, specific oil, VLSFO and all sort of oil. So with those markets, those are largely closed off due to the sanctions because now with sanctions Europe is not getting any Russian gas and US has completely stopped buying Russian oil. So having said that, Russia has had to pivot eastward because they now to look for the new buyers in the market because it is not like that if Europe is not purchasing any gas or crude oil then they have to sit idle because Russian companies need to manage their buyers outside of European horizon. So they focus on countries like China, India, and Turkey because they were one of the massive buyers. So these nations they have capitalized on the situation and they started purchasing Russian crude at steep discounts. And at the start of war, we have seen that these discounts amounting around $30 to $40, and at that time prices were around $65 to $70. And having said that, these are the kind of pricing amount which are the below global market prices. So the shift that has not been without any challenges because if you see the trade pattern, transporting oil to Asia, it involves significantly longer routes because if Russia has to transport Europe, it will be a shorter voyage. But at the same time, if it has to transport to Asia, it's a longer voyage compared to that. And that has increased the shipping cost by as much as 25%. And for example, if shipping Russian oil to China, it takes considerably more time and resources than delivering to European ports. And this strain on global shipping lanes has contributed to higher freight rates and a surge in demand for tankers. And the introduction of the G7 price cap, that is capping Russian oil at $60 per barrel, and this is about the crude oil because in the sanctions the price cap were different for crude oil and different for petroleum products. So this price cap it has further forced Russia to sell oil at discounted rates. While this has kept Russian crude oil flowing to Asian market, the revenue Russia is supposed to get, now they get lesser than what they're supposed to get because they has to give a discount and this resulted into their earnings dropped dramatically. And it was especially when the oil they were selling, it was under the discount and the global benchmark was $70, $80 per barrel. So it was around $30-$40 drop. So if we have a price of crude oil at $80 and Russia is giving discount $40, so they are selling their crude oil at half a price. So having said that, despite these challenges, the sheer volume of oil being shipped to Asia is helping Russia to offset some of the losses. But think from this perspective, the impact of sanctions extend beyond just trade routes and prices. The Russia hopes of attracting significant investment in its oil and gas sector, specifically from its counterparts. Those are the newly buyers of Russian oil. Those are China, India, and the Southeast Asian countries. They have largely gone unfulfilled because the secondary sanctions, those are excessive wartime regulations and the heightened risk of operating in Russia, have deterred foreign investors. So we have seen some of the investors, those are already present. Those are from global oil companies, Exxon, Chevron. They started moving away from Russia. And the transition was not as simple as that. Some of the companies are also trying to move away with the Russian association. So even on paper, they have declared that they were trying to sell this oil at higher than whatever the cap is present for that particular crude oil. Because even if company is operating in Russia, that is non-Russian companies operating in Russian oil field, they have to sell the Russian oil at the same price cap. Another example, if I have to give, Chinese and Indian companies, those have been hesitant to inject any capital into Russian energy project. We have, when talking about in terms of India, we have some of the stake in Russia's Sakhalin oil field and gas field, but those are now any new investment is now challenging. And we have seen by the end of 2021, China's total foreign direct investment in Russia and across all sectors, it was just around $3 billion. And while India was around $600 million. Having said that, since the invasion of Ukraine, we have seen no significant new FDI from both of these countries, and we have not seen some of FDI in future also. So even existing collaboration have faced the setbacks. Chinese firms like Sinopec have suspended joint ventures with Russian companies, and we can give an example such as Sibur, mostly due to geopolitical uncertainties. Now, meanwhile, replacing Western technology with Chinese alternatives have proven costly. For instance, Russia's Novatek reported a 17% increase in capital expenditure and it amounting nearly $4 billion for its Arctic LNG 2 project after switching it from Baker Hughes turbines to equipment from Shanghai Electric. Because due to the sanctions, Baker Hughes supposed to leave the Russian business, and then that business eventually went to Shanghai Electric, which even sold these turbines at higher prices. So this is a emblematic of broader cost increase and efficiency losses across the Russian energy sector. Now, talking about buyer side, let's talk about the countries like in China. They appear more interested in taking advantage of discounted Russian energy. That is a crude oil and even LNG for some sort of. And they were more interested in the this oil and gas purchases than in investing in its infrastructure. And if you see closely or monitor it, the transaction, it highlights a growing transactional nature in Russia's relationships with these nations. But rather than a kind of a strategic energy partnerships, this Russia may have hoped for. And in Europe, the decoupling from Russian oil gas has been striking. According to European Commission, Russia's share of EU oil imports fell from 24.8% in the fourth quarter of 2021 to just 3.5% by the fourth quarter of 2023. And similarly, if we see the pipeline gas imports, it dropped from 48% to 12.7% over the same period. So this decoupling has significantly reduced Russia's leverage over Europe, and it dismantles its ability to use energy as geopolitical weapon against Western democracies. Now, on other side, if we have to see from the perspective of Europe, what they have done is they have just shifted their dependency from Russian gas to US LNG, because we have seen the offset that is occurred by dropping of Russian gas imports. It was kind of equated by US LNG imports. So, having said that, what Europe has done is just shifted their energy dependence, and US kind of saves Europe from Russian sanctions. So, having said that, if I have to say, the USA practically saved Europe from Russia or the Russian gas because they have a higher gas production, because most of the gas that is produced in USA, those are the either direct coming from the gas field or it was mostly associated gas. So if they have to increase gas production, they have to increase oil production too. If they want to produce high crude oil, the prices of crude oil needs to be average around $75 per barrel. So in the 2014, when we have seen a price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, the reason behind the price war was the same, because Russia want to stabilize the prices around $20, but Saudi Arabia wants higher oil price that is around $90, which is exactly what Russia didn't want. Because at the same time, USA already started processing their LNG towards Europe, and because we have seen from the evidence that they have opposed this gas pipeline coming from Russia to Germany, that is Nord Stream 2. So they opposed to that, and this is how the market structure went with this geopolitical tensions. So coming back to Russian geopolitical situation where it cannot use energy as a geopolitical weapon. As for whether these changes are permanent, it's difficult to say because we don't know what will happen in future and where there will be a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. But the global oil market is highly dynamic and it is influenced by situations like or factors like political, economic, and technological. If the price gap tightens further, let's say crude oil prices will drop further, or we may say that Asian buyers like China and India face increased pressure to comply with Western sanctions. We could see an additional disruptions in the crude oil supply from Russia. Having said that, converse is also true because if sanction ease or there is a geopolitical alliance shift, some of these changes could be reversed and Russia soon could again utilize energy as a geopolitical weapon. So, having said that, for now, what I think is it's clear that the sanctions have forced Russia to adapt quickly, often at a significant cost. But the long term impact will depend on how the global energy landscape evolves and whether Russia can navigate its current challenges to find a more sustainable footing in the market.
Very rightly said, Sandesh. I think we will have to wait and see as far as how the sanctions are going to play out. Well, I have another question regarding the shadow fleet facing more scrutiny. So tell us, Sandesh, what if the global community cracks down even more on the shadow fleet? How will that impact Russia's ability to export oil, and what kind of consequences would we see?
Well, I was expecting that question. If I have to see the global community, it tightens its grip on the shadow fleet. So it would definitely put more pressure on Russia's ability to export oil. That is one point. One of the biggest risks to the shadow fleet is increased scrutiny by Western governments. And when we say Western government, then we have to see those allies between US and their other counterparts, a kind of a coalition which is responsible for putting sanctions on Russia. So, having said that, if sanctions are forced more aggressively and countries that allow these vessels to operate, they could face penalties themselves. And the second point is that there is also the risks of more international regulations. And let me give an example. The US has already warned that it might impose secondary sanctions on countries that provide support to Russian tankers. And if these countries face economic consequences, they may have to stop allowing this shadow fleet vessel to operate under their flags. Having said that, kind of a difficult also because during the flagging, we don't know whether vessel is going to be trade in the Russian oil business or not. And even if we have a documented evidence that a particular ship has already did a Russian business, but they have now change of ownership, so it could be a difficult for even a flagging in nations to whether to allow any shadow fleet vessel to operate or not. While this is about the nations to whether they want to flag allow the flagging of vessel, the impact on Russia would be immediate because these vessels, those are under the shadow fleet, they will getting reduced because now they will be more scrutinized and they will be kind of in a region or kind of a ownership which is not ready to do any Russian business. So that means fewer vessel will be available to ship Russian oil, and Russia would have to find other ways to bypass this regulation. So one fundamental thing about Russia is they have learned from Iranians because Iran has kind of a sanctions from long back. They that means USA has put sanctions on Iran since as long as last 2 decades. But because their national oil company owns larger vessels like VLCC and Suezmax, they were able to sail their crude oil by bypassing those regulations. And Russians has learned from them because they were also having larger vessels like VLCC and some of the smaller vessels like Suezmax and Aframax. Having said that, if lesser ships will be available to transport Russian crude oil, it will increase the cost and then decrease the exports of Russian oil. So prices for Russian oil could drop further and fewer buyers able to get the oil. So this is one view, but the other view is that there will be a demand construction mechanism will be coming out, because then Russian oil will be very high discount were available on the Russian oil, and then let's say independent refineries in China, or those are the teapot refineries, they will be getting prompted to buy this cheaper oil, because eventually it will end up in the processing, and they will eventually able to increase their refinery margin and the cost of yield in the long term. So for the shipping industry, for the all types of shipping operation, more scrutiny means higher operational cost and even more complicated logistics. This shadow fleet is already operating under a cloud of uncertainty, and any tightening of the rules, it could increase the risk of fines or even seizure of vessel, and which would make it even harder for these ships to operate. So to summarize this, there may be a kind of a high scrutiny will be coming from this coalition of US-led Western economies, but on a practical basis, it's kind of a shaky situation, because there are too many different vessels present in the market, and whether checking every such vessels, it would be a difficult situation. And then the real question is that which country or which such organization will be utilized to carry those operations for this scrutiny, and whether Europe, if let's say if Europe is going to go for the scrutiny of all those such tankers, whether they will have enough manpower to do that. So these are some of the questions that I feel is still lingering, and that's why I don't think there will be any stricter scrutiny will be there. Some of the sanctions or some of the tankers, those they can operate or they can scrutinize, but all the other vessels, we have already said that around 340 such vessels are there currently present in the market. The facts or the statistics given by Ukraine said that around 340 such vessels are present in the market. So even if we exclude the remaining vessel, the scrutinizing this entire 340 vessel itself is a difficult task. So, on a large scale basis, this scrutiny, I don't think it will be ever implemented. So, in short, while the shadow fleet is working for now, increased scrutiny could be destabilize Russia's oil trade, and thus it makes things even more difficult for the global shipping market.
That was a very impressive overview, Sandesh. Now, I have a very trick question for you that I'd like to ask. With everything that we've talked about, how long do you think the shadow fleet can continue operating in its current form? And is this something that we can go on for years, or are there any limits to it?
Well, Trisha, that's a tough question. On the one hand, the shadow fleet is thriving right now, especially as Russia continues to shift its export to Asia. The fleet has adapted to sanctions by using clever tactics like turning off AIS, that is, a tracking devices, and then changing the ship flags very frequently. But there are big risks on the horizon. First, there is a growing threat of international pressure. So, if more countries impose sanctions or regulations, the shadow fleet could find itself without a safe haven. Some countries are already facing pressure from the US to stop allowing these tankers to operate under their flag. So if that continues, we could see a significant decline in the shadow fleets in terms of size and activity. So on the second hand side, we see that there is a risk of an environmental disaster. So if one of the vessels, it could cause the major spill or accident, it could spark an international outrage, and it may push governments to take a stronger actions, and it could lead to a stricter regulation that makes it even harder for these ships to operate. Well, I like to mention one more point here. Let's say, I mean, if we have to see the how shadow fleet operations, or how this momentum is going on, and how it will restrict them itself in terms of trading in the global fleet. So let's assume that one of the Greek shipping company, it may have 100 oil tankers, and amongst 100, let's say for example 20 are the older fleet and 30 sanctioned tankers, and rest 50 fleet is a globally traded fleet or kind of a modern fleet that is available to trade. So in a condition where the crude oil demand getting decline, we have seen the same thing with China in last quarter where there was a demand decline. So in such event, the oil trade, that is oil supposed to going from Russia to China, it will decrease. And when we say it will decrease, there will be a lesser requirement of tankers. So in such event, what a shipping company will do, they will have three options. First, either continue with the older fleet, or continue with the sanctioned fleet, or continue with the preferred tradable fleet. Ship owner will have to go for a third option, that is it will prefer modern tonnage or the modern ship, or those are the kind of a tradable ship which is favored in the market. So the question is, why not take a second option, that is go for the sanctioned fleet to market? Because ship owner doesn't want to risk their ships to be on radar despite it is already been blacklisted. On the other hand, the ship owner also don't want to engage any older tankers into the market, because older tanker has high operating cost and older tanker have high break-even earnings. So when you have a less demand in the market, you will be having a high tonnage present in the market for trade, and thus it will reduce your spot earning for any type of vessel. And if you have a lesser earnings in the market, even after you have vessels, those are available to trade, you keen to go for the modern tonnage because it is a kind of a eco tonnage that will save significantly on market conditions in terms of earnings, and at the same time it will also help ship owner to kind of continue its business on profitable note. So same thing, if an older tankers, those are present in the market, they will not be able to get employment when we have a lesser demand for tonnage in the market. The same theory can also be applicable for other types of commodities. If I just have to give an example of China, where LNG trucking industry is growing significantly. So let's say in the similar context, if you have a trucks, those are running on LNG, and then the trucks, those are running on diesel fuel or fossil fuel. So in that particular case, if China has a lesser demand, which is have which a condition right now in the Chinese market, if they have a lesser demand, they are prone to employ their modern LNG trucks because it has a lesser break even and higher savings. But if there is a tremendous demand in the market, they will just switch their buying pattern, and thus they will achieve what they want to achieve in terms of savings and in terms of usage of tankers. So Trisha, this is how shadow fleet employment pattern is working on, and in the similar fashion how Chinese LNG trucks are working. So to summarize that, while the shadow fleet is likely to continue in the short term, there are real limits to how long it can operate under the radar. And the question is whether those limits will come sooner rather than later. Because, even if there is an immediate ceasefire in the coming future, or let's say in a 2-3 months time, it's not like that this shadow fleet will immediately switch to normal trading or any traditional business. So we have to see how this working will take place in the future, and what will be the future for this shadow fleet. We have seen in the past that one of the vessel is mistakenly sanctioned or mistakenly blacklisted, and then this particular company has appealed in the US courts, and then they were getting relief from this blacklisting, and this particular vessel has been removed from blacklist. So in a similar fashion, we have to see whether such kind of mechanism will be evolved in future, because shadow fleet are kind of a issue right now, but it is more towards with respect to US led coalition. But for India and China, it's kind of a positive benefit in terms of getting crude oil importation. So that's it from my side. Thanks, Trisha.
Thank you, Sandesh, for shedding so much light on this complex issue. It's definitely clear that the shadow fleet is a game changer for global trade and shipping, and we'll have to continue to follow these developments closely.
Well, thanks, Trisha. It's been a pleasure to discuss this evolving topic. And the impact of these sanctions on global trade, it will continue to unfold, and it will be interesting to see how the shipping industry adapts in the coming months or years.
Thank you so much, Sandesh. And I guess that's a wrap for today's episode. And to all our listeners, we hope you've gained some valuable perspectives on how Western sanctions are affecting the tanker market and all about the shadow fleet. So we'll be back next week with more insights. Until then, navigate safely and stay informed.